Okay, we are now recording.
Good morning. This meeting of the Agricultural Labor Relations Board is now called to order. I will first go through the roll. Please say aye if you are present. Board Member Broad.
Present.
Board Member Flores.
Aye.
Board Member Hall notified us to be absent today. Board Member Lightstone.
Present.
Thank you. Also present today from our staff is our Executive Secretary, Santiago Avila Gomez, who is providing technical support. Please, you can find his email on the agenda should you need anything. Our first agenda item is to approve the meeting minutes from December 11th, 2024. May I have a motion?
So moved.
May I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Cynthia. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
The meeting minutes are approved. Our next agenda item is the chair's report. I do not have a report today. So we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is the executive officer's report on elections, unfair labor practices and complaints and hearings presented by our executive officer, Santiago Avila Gomez. Santiago.
Good morning again, Chair Hussey, members of the board. No written report today for folks. There is just one update regarding Nagatashi Farm Inc. And the case number there is 2023 CE 050-SAL. We were informed by the parties yesterday that they have settled and will be filing a motion to remove it from our hearing calendar. That concludes my updates for today.
Thank you, Santiago. Next, we have the litigation report with our Chief Board Counsel, Laura Hike. Laura.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So all the litigation I'm going to report on involves Wonderful Nurseries, LLC. The first matter is the matter in Kern County Superior Court. That's case number BCV-24-101649. There is a case management conference scheduled for tomorrow, but our DAG team informed me that the parties met and conferred February 13th about filing a joint case management statement indicating there's no opposition to the court continuing that case management conference. So haven't heard an update as of today, but it looks like that is going to be continued while the appellate matters are pending. Case number, these two matters are in the 5th District Court of Appeal. Case number F088632/F088639. This is the ALRB's and UFW's petitions for writ of mandate challenging Superior Court's denial of the ALRB's demurrer to the complaint filed in Kern County. That matter has, as of December 24th, is fully briefed. The next matter is also in 5th District Court of Appeal. That's case number F088515/F088520. That's the ALRB and UFW's appeals of the Superior Court order granting preliminary injunction. The board and UFW's opening briefs on appeal were filed February 7th. Wonderful's answering brief is due on or before March 10th, and the board's and UFW's reply briefs, if any, are due 20 days after the answering brief is filed. And finally, in Wonderful Nurseries LLC versus ALRB et al. This is the matter that was filed in the Eastern District of California at the end of last year. This is case number 1:CV-01601-CDB. So the complaint in this matter, I don't think I've reported on this yet, because we haven't had a board meeting since this matter was filed, so I'll give you the full background. The complaint in this matter alleges that the board's enforcement of the mandatory mediation conciliation process in this matter violates the due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment. One also seeks a declaration that the MMC statute's unconstitutional on its face and also seeks injunctive relief. On January 22nd, the UFW filed a motion for leave to intervene in this matter. Wonderful filed an opposition to the UFW's motion. I don't have the date on that, but it was fairly recent. There's going to be a hearing on that motion March 3rd at 1:30. Then on February 3rd, a group of wonderful employees represented by the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation filed a motion to intervene. These are the same employees and it's the same law firm who sought to intervene in the state case, as well as the underlying administrative proceeding. The board successfully opposed their intervention in that proceeding. The board's opposition to the motion to intervene was filed yesterday, and a hearing on that motion will be on March 17th. Wonderful filed a motion for a preliminary injunction on February 10th. The board's opposition to that motion is due February 24th. And the hearing on the motion for the preliminary injunction is also going to be on March 17th. And finally, the court granted an extension of time for the board to file a response to the complaint itself. And that due date is now April 1st. That concludes the litigation report. Any questions?
No questions.
Lots of things happening.
Thank you for
Yeah.
helping steer us through. Do any of my colleagues have any questions? Thank you so much, Laura, and thanks to our DOJ team.
Yes.
A pleasure to work
they've
with.
been pretty busy.
Yes, it was very
Especially
busy.
February's been very busy.
Thank you. We do not have a general counsel's report today, so we will turn to our next agenda item, which is our administrative services report presented by our Chief of Administration, Rasha Salama. Rasha.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Key updates for this month are our two budget change proposals that are now in front of the legislature. We have one proposal, which is funding for the new labor agency building relocation. So this is relocation of the Sacramento office to the new labor agency. And this is in conjunction, this proposal is in conjunction with all the other departments that will also be moving into that building. The second proposal is for the unanticipated additional workload costs generated by AB 113. That proposal includes 7 new positions and roughly $1.9 million to cover costs for those positions, as well as DOJ costs for implementation of AB 113. Budget hearings have not been set, but we anticipate for those to be in March. So as we find out those dates, we will report up on that. And the only other plug I have is please utilize your networks to amplify our posted positions. We have 7 positions that are currently posted on our Cal Careers link. If you want that link, we can supply it, but we always like to amplify through folks that do the work. So that's my little plug. Thank you.
And one of those is for a board council position, which I believe closes tomorrow. So if you know of anyone and haven't encouraged them now, send a text during this meeting. All right, okay, we do not have a legislative or regulatory update
Just
today.
the regulatory update is that my understanding is that OALs, they have 30 working days to review our reg package, and by my count, that is up Tuesday the 25th. I reached out to them yesterday to confirm that, and the person assigned to our reviews was supposed to email me back, but I haven't heard yet. But as far as I know, and I'll update you if there's a change. Their time is up Tuesday. So hopefully we'll know something very soon.
Great, thank you. I'm hoping no news is good news.
That's right. Crossing my fingers very hard.
All right, so next on our agenda, I am pleased to share, we have a special presentation in honor of Black History Month. We are fortunate to have Dr. Robin Muhammad here with us. She's an associate professor at Ohio University, and she's going to share a talk with us entitled Harbors and Homes, the African American Labor Movement in California, Past and Present. Before I present her biography, I do just want to note, as we've seen, particularly in the last few weeks and months, there's been a national discussion that has been, in my view, quite troubling, where there's been a renunciation of policies and initiatives and activities that promote the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This discussion has been wide-ranging and led to further discussion of whether it's appropriate or even productive, and really questioning the utility of engaging activities that recognize different races, ethnicities, genders, and other groups, and the value of that. And I want to stand firmly in saying that here, I'm very proud that California continues to proudly recognize the contributions of a variety of people from all backgrounds that make our state great, understanding that diversity is in fact our strength, and that reckoning with history, even when it's uncomfortable, is an important aspect of informing and improving upon how we govern ourselves and build a stronger, happier, and more equitable society. It's how we learn. It's how we recruit the best talent to our organizations, our communities, and become better for it. We deliberately chose to feature this presentation at this board meeting as we believe understanding the history of the labor movement, in all its different facets, can better inform our work and the public about the important role of labor relations and the role that we play as public servants to further this policy goal. So I think we're so fortunate, and I'm just so grateful to Dr. Muhammad for giving this talk today. And without further ado, I'll just give a little brief additional background about her. She received her BA from UC Davis, woohoo, and her PhD in history from Carnegie Mellon University. As a labor historian, she studies workers, their communities, and their political institutions. Her most recent focus has been a study of the African American experience in the shipbuilding industry in Northern California, and she has written a manuscript, Arsenal of Liberation, on the topic. Her research traces the challenges and limitations of liberal coalitions, technological innovations, and federal policy. Without further ado.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here to share with you some thoughts and research that I've come across over the last 20 years, looking at the labor movement broadly, and more specifically, the role of Black workers in the labor movement. In a way, it's a kind of coming home here. I live in Davis. I teach in Ohio University. A lot of my research is on the West Coast, but I toggle back and forth between those two places. And downtown Sacramento is also a bit of a workplace home. As an undergraduate at UC Davis, I served out a year-long internship at the Office of Migrant Services over on K Street. And so when Michaela asked me if I needed to know anything about parking, I said, no, I've got it under control. I know how to navigate. But a pleasure to be here and to sort of really in some ways continue the work that I was mentored in at the Office of Migrant Services, looking at the role of workers, their needs, their challenges, including housing specifically. So Santiago, if you could move to the actually at this point, we can move on to the second slide where it says labor research, that would be terrific.
Will do. Hold just a moment.
Thank you. And
It's on.
on to the next one, because I
I'm not updating yours.
fulfilled the title page.
There we go.
Terrific, thank you. So at the outset, part of what my research is interested in is in the terms of African-American workers in the West, this sort of consortium of agricultural, maritime, entrepreneurial, and other industries that were central to how a relatively small Black population in the 19th century could provide the foundation for the growth of the African-American labor movement into the 20th century. So in that first row of pictures, the two in the middle are instructive of a couple of things. One, the Archie Lee cover plate for a recent study of the case of In re Archie from 1858 was considered the Dred Scott case of California. And in that case, an enslaved person known as Archie Lee was brought from Mississippi to California with the and petitioned to be freed. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, this was contradicted, and he was ultimately successful in gaining his freedom. However, part of the atmosphere in California at the time was in some ways not to allow slavery to enter the state, but parallel with that, not to allow people of African descent to enter the state. And so it was this sort of mixed atmosphere that even though Archie Lee was successful in his petition for freedom, he and a number of African Americans left the state and emigrated to Canada. The photograph next to it, I wanted to highlight because it's a late 19th century picture that highlights the extractive industry, specifically gold mining. And under the recognition school of thought, in terms of labor history, you see a lot of these stories. So African Americans in mining, African Americans in some farming, and we don't really move beyond sort of this recognizing these case studies until the middle of the 20th century. And then the African American experience in terms of labor and community building widens for a lot of reasons in the post-war period. But these are industries in which African-American workers begin and continue to work in. To the left and the right of the Archie Lee and gold mining photos, you see two different depictions of the role of African-Americans in agricultural work. Certainly, there's been a lot of research on the way in which Black Westerners, as ranch owners, farmers, farm workers, were instrumental in building up these settlements that I'll talk a little bit more about, as well as the African-American labor icon, if you will, on the left. It's from the 1930s. And what we see in terms of the social and cultural history that develops around the African-American experience in the first half of the 20th century is a strong sort of hearkening to the role of Black workers, particularly Black men, in agriculture as well as in industry. Below that, there are two photographs that are among my favorites, partly because they represent a little bit more of a dimension to the Black experience in California. On the left, there's a family photo, and this is of Captain William Shorey and his wife, Julia, their two daughters, Zenobia and Victoria. This is in 1910. Captain Shorey started out as an ordinary seaman, works up to owning his own shipping company, and is one of the wealthiest African Americans in California. That area of maritime industry is, until recently, had been largely ignored or minimized because it wasn't sort of seen as part of the Black experience rooted in industry and agriculture. But for the West, it's absolutely critical, particularly in California. To the right, we have a group of educators in one of these settlements that I want to mention in a moment. These are educators in Allensworth. One of the trajectories that bring African Americans to the West in larger numbers is a particular interpretation of the California Dream. And one of those aspects of the California Dream for African Americans is better education, better political opportunities, enforcement of rights. And these women were teachers in Allensworth, which is one of the probably about 24 Black townships that are formed in California at the end of the 19th century, and many of which continue into the 20th century. Next slide, please. Well, no discussion of the African American labor movement would be complete without a map. And this map is useful on two levels. One, it shows the trajectory of what are really two great migrations. There's the Great Migration around World War I, and then another one during and after World War II. These also follow the lines of the railroad tracks, the railroad lines throughout, particularly in the West. And these are critical for facilitating the movement of African Americans and others to the West Coast. It's also a union story, specifically a Black union story, with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids. The West Coast was headquartered in Oakland with C.L. Dellums, uncle of Ron Dellums, and another in Los Angeles. So these workers on the railroads were working in the West, but they were also bringing information back and forth between the West Coast, then the Midwest and the South. Information about jobs, housing opportunities, health and medical services that might be available. In other words, sort of sifting through what would be the push and pull factors for African Americans to decide whether or not to move to the West. All through this period, late 19th century into the 20th century, the Black townships that are formed during that time focus on three areas of employment: farming, financial institutions, and retail services. So these settlements, such as in Allensworth and elsewhere, were in many ways attempting to be sort of self-contained, not out of a need to self-segregate, but to be autonomous as much as possible. And they become more inclusive communities as people recognize some of the benefits of participating in those thriving communities of farming, banking, and retail services. California has the second largest number of Black townships, second only to Oklahoma during this period. Next slide, please, Santiago. And I should also pause just for a moment to say, if there are questions at the end, I'm happy to answer any questions. And also, given that we have time concerns, my contact information is available if anyone wants to email me afterwards with questions. Although you do risk getting a bibliography. I am, after all, the historian. So, watershed moment. So I titled my book manuscript "Arsenal of Liberation," sort of a takeoff on the catchphrase of World War II era, the arsenal of democracy. So for African Americans, not just Northern California, which these two photos represent, the two seascapes, but also Southern California. The defense industries represent a major pull factor for African American laborers, workers, skilled and so-called unskilled, to come to California in increased numbers. And one of the reasons that they're able to do that fairly successfully is that many of the institutions, including the unions, Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, church and faith communities, civic organizations, civil rights organizations, and fraternal organizations had already established a kind of network that would allow them to just get information and temporary housing, which was of critical importance during World War II. This was what was termed as a kind of racial frontier. The California Dream included an idea around tolerance, around coalition building and collaboration from various groups of people with different backgrounds. As a result, the population, African American population in the state moves from about 1 or 2% of the total state population to 12% or more in just less than a decade. One of the institutions that I think is really critical for mid-20th century African-American workers and professionals is the Fair Employment Practice Committee that was established in 1941. It's one through executive order, it's one that has had provided investigatory, but not necessarily punitive powers. And in 1943, another executive order will expand this agency to have individual regional offices, so that there are 12 or 13 regional offices, one in San Francisco for the West Coast. So people cannot rely on simply letters or documentation through some other means. A lot of letters to Eleanor Roosevelt will end up in the FEPC because often people, they didn't have a place to go to file their grievance. They didn't have the means by which they could hire attorneys. And the NAACP was stretched pretty thin during World War II. This is remarkable because what happens by having an actual physical place for people to go, you begin to generate an enormous set of documents that tell us something about how workers were organizing. So the Fair Employment Practice Committee opens up its headquarters at 1355 Market Street. It was the newly created Western Furniture Exchange and Merchandise Mart, built in 1937. It is still there, and it is now the headquarters of X-Twitter. I could probably do an entire lecture just on that, but I won't. I say that because when we look at what workers were talking about in the 1940s about their experience in the shipyards, we get an interesting, revealing view of the limitations of this executive order and the opportunities that they made the most out of it. The executive order only applied to government contractees and unions involved in those contracts. And it only applied to anti-discrimination as it related to race, ethnicity, national origin, and religion. Sexual discrimination was not covered. For Black women in the Bay Area, this becomes really central to them. 90% of the African Americans in the shipyards in the Bay Area were men, skilled, semi-skilled, and so-called unskilled. 10% of Black shipyard workers in the Bay Area are women. However, when we look at the FEPC records, more than half are filed by women. And what the women are doing is coming not just singly, one at a time, they're coming in twos, in pairs, 4, 6 women, coming to these offices, filing their grievance, providing affidavits, and then taking that information back to the NAACP, back to their auxiliary union organizations, and which I'll talk about in a moment, and essentially creating a coalition of civic, legal, civil rights, church groups that will be the foundation of what becomes known as liberal politics in California after the war. During this time, the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers has a master agreement with the shipbuilders in the Bay Area. On the East Coast, it's a slightly different story, more of a mixed group, mainly the CIO. However, the Boilermakers have a clear statement in their constitution that non-whites are not allowed. So in an attempt to get around the executive order, they set up what are known as auxiliary or Jim Crow unions. You can, next slide, please, Santiago. And for this reason, Black women are both isolated in terms of their numbers in the workplace, but also isolated institutionally because of their underrepresentation in terms of the union movement. So they really have to develop networks that are not going to be relying on these sort of traditional labor institutions. They rely on these experiences to build up and ultimately challenge the auxiliary system, the auxiliary unions, which are defeated by 1945, 1946, which doesn't do a whole lot for people who have been pushed out of the jobs by the end of the war. but it was a really important landmark case, James versus Marin Ship. I put this photo here, or like this, because I like to show students and others, there's a really a variety of things that we can glean from the photo records, whether they're coming from propaganda or union pamphlets, etc. One of the main concerns of workers in the shipyards and in other defense industries, this is a spark plug plant, is safety. These are workplaces that are full of toxic chemicals. Shipyards are traditionally very decentralized. The emergency shipyards that were created in the Los Angeles area, and particularly in the Bay Area, are built seemingly overnight, and they are very dispersed and decentralized. So supervision is uneven, sometimes intentionally. And African-American women talk about feeling that they are being placed in the most risky jobs with the most exposure to chemicals. And so what will come out, and again, this is not covered by the executive order, by the FEPC, it can be recorded, but it becomes part of why we see so much after the World War II, an emphasis on African-American workers talking about working conditions, particularly with the proximity to toxic chemicals, lead paint, etc. And we can see a parallel with other industries in terms of, for example, agriculture, in which workplaces have this potential exposure to chemicals in unsafe conditions. Next page, please. Thank you. So in this post-war period, running from 1945 into the 1970s, we can ask what has been retained and what has changed. Part of what is retained certainly are these labor coalitions, civil rights coalitions that were formed in the midst of the war with this dramatically increased population of African Americans and other people of color. What is relatively new is the fight for housing. Now, if the wartime had been sort of the struggle for any kind of housing, some housing in creation, of some sort of creation, the housing struggle for African American workers and others after the war pivots around desegregation, which had been a problem during World War II, but also just availability of it. Workers understand that their proximity to their place of work is important, that longer commutes are not always feasible or possible, and that if they are expending resources to get to work in housing that is either inadequate or dangerous, this creates a burden that many unions are aware of, but not taking the lead on. And this is where African American labor movement is key. The picture in the middle is a redlining depiction of Sacramento in the late 1940s, and it's one of the ways in which African Americans, through the legislature and other means, are pressing for fair housing. This is something that is still practiced even after Shelley v. Kramer, the discrimination and the restrictive covenants, and it continues to be an issue both in public housing as well as private housing. The last photo shows kind of a stock photo of maritime industries today. And this is an area where African Americans retained a certain foothold, even though the containerization in the ports really changes not just how and which ships are built, but what is the nature of work in those harbors. The relative importance of railroad work declines after the World War II period, but we do see a marked increase in the presence of African American workers in the SEIU, so the Service Employees International Union, as well as in the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees in AFSCME. These areas in terms of transportation, shipping, that longer history, as well as service workers and government workers, really form the foundation of African-American labor movement in California in the 20th century, the late 20th century. The last slide, please. Everyone's thrilled to hear that. The last slide, just to sum up some of the contemporary issues that we're seeing, and for a historian, contemporary means the last 20 years, but it might also be today. There's continued advocating for legislative and policy changes on the current economic landscape. The concern of transportation workers, public employees, shipping workers, public transportation, including buses and trains, particularly in this climate, is of foremost importance. People are feeling that threat and have actually experienced that threat of having their jobs phased out. We're also trying to understand what happens to the California dream. What does that mean for people, other than the working, getting a job, that kind of tolerance that was promoted, and home ownership. For African Americans, their rate of home ownership had actually been quite solid up until through World War II. Many cities, it's 40% of African Americans own their own home in cities like Seattle, Oakland, and in parts of Southern California. What happens to that California dream? African American Union leadership is talking about the next generation. We have an aging workforce. For African Americans, more than the population that is 55 and older is the largest segment of the African American workforce in California. How do we mentor young labor leaders, civic leaders for the future when the workforce is in of itself shrinking? Part of that is turning to these coalitions that have a long history of environmental groups, civil rights groups, and political groups that have been informed by many of the experiences of those shipyard workers and others who are saying there's what you do to the terrain, you do to the workers, and vice versa. And finally, centering education in the humanities and STEM fields. Because the African American labor movement has had that sort of long-standing partnership between industrial workers, agricultural workers, and the Black middle class, entrepreneurial. This is getting some more attention because the quote unquote old debate of vocational versus a college education is resurfacing, if it ever went underneath the surface. It's there to talk about how do we move forward, how do we prepare people for the jobs of today and tomorrow. So with that, I'll close by saying, again, this has been a terrific experience to be able to share with you in a capsulated form the African American labor movement, and I welcome any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. That I learned a lot, made some notes. I would welcome the bibliography.
Okay.
I like a good reading list. I
Good.
will turn to my colleagues to see if anyone has any questions or comments.
So have you kind of studied migrant farm labor in California? Is that part of your?
Yes, it's in terms of particularly in 1930s.
Because it seems like, you know, African Americans were a significant part of the agricultural workforce in California,
Mhm,
and at some point it disappeared.
mhm,
I mean, I think maybe in the 50s,
mhm,
early 50s.
Mhm.
And I've always wondered why.
Mm.
I mean, was it that if you could get any other kind of job, you'd rather get a job than in agriculture, or is it that the population became more urbanized, or I don't know. I mean, other ethnic groups have also sort of moved through agriculture,
Sure.
but or was it related to the mechanization, for example, of cotton? I mean, cotton was a huge crop in California.
Mhm,
It's not as dominant as it was, and I know from prior research and stuff that I've done, that they invented, mechanization of cotton to get rid of labor. I mean, that was the point of it, and it wasn't just to make it more productive. It was like, we gotta be done with
Sure.
an agricultural workforce and just mechanize everything.
Well, I think to the first part of your question, part of what we see in terms of the decline of Black agricultural enterprises generally, not just farm workers, but farmers, farm owners, is sort of the story of what happens to some of these Black settlements. That they have a certain level of sustainability, and then they're no different than any other small family farms. They sort of experience that pushing out. Part of that pushing out is suburbanization, which is sort of the push factor, and part of it is the draw into cities for education and for industrial professional jobs. So there's that piece. The cotton piece is really interesting because, as I understand it, the cotton industry in California is very intentional from the beginning in terms of limiting the certain strain, the Alcala strain of cotton, because it's fairly quick growing, fairly resistant, open to more mechanization. But California cotton growers envisioned a place where they would draw on a largely Latinx population for the cultivation and harvesting of cotton. So the story of cotton in Texas, predominant with African Americans, almost on par with Latinx workers, migrant workers. California is a little bit different. It has a shift, partly because they don't want it to look like Texas. Right? They don't really, they're trying to squeeze out Black labor.
For racist reasons,
That would,
or for some,
they see it
for
as,
direct racism, like we don't want African Americans to work in our industry, or is it some other extrinsic economic factors?
it's, I think from my perspective, it's all jumbled up together. Because in Texas, part of what you also have, in a comparative point, is you also have a strong Black union movement in port cities like Galveston. Okay? So the presence of a strong Black labor movement in Texas intersects with a comparatively stronger Black agricultural labor movement. They have property, they have a certain amount of muscle. They can threaten a strike, they can threaten to shut down ports. That's not the case in California, right? They don't have that same sort of coalition and sort of numbers in terms of strength. So I think that for the California growers, they're understanding we want cheap, malleable labor. Where can we get it? And they're looking at, this is in the 20s and 30s, they're looking at Latinx populations. There aren't numerically significant enough of African Americans in that capacity from their perspective to worry about. Right? They want fewer workers, but they want more malleable workers. And their vision of that is largely people of color, of Latinx descent.
Were there any efforts by African American ag workers, either in Texas or elsewhere, to try and push for labor protections that they had been excluded from, that all of ag had been excluded from after the National Labor Relations Act had passed? I wonder if that's another aspect of that.
Well, I think what we see certainly in the 60s is part of this, what happens with this coalition is that Black labor leaders, even though the numerically are not, there aren't a lot, comparatively, there aren't a lot of African Americans in migrant work. What they see this as is common cause. So they see that common cause in terms of, this is the 60s and the 70s, and they understand that this bifurcation of this is agricultural and this is industrial and these are service workers, they begin to sort of see that there's commonalities. And so you see African American laborers talking about Cesar Chavez and saying, this is a movement we need to support. We're not only we are a part of it, but it goes back to our concerns about toxic workplaces, poor working conditions, poor wages and a lack of union representation. I think that does it, yeah.
I apologize, I have to jump for 11 a.m., but this conversation can keep going, and we may have members of the public that want to ask, or our staff that are in other offices that may want to ask questions, and then Ralph, you can just, with Santiago, leave public comment, and then I think,
Okay.
yeah. And I am so grateful, this was so interesting, and I'm glad it's recorded. I know our general counsel really wanted to watch it today too, and she's out this week, and she's like, please tell me it's recorded. So.
We can always close these out with, when is our next meeting? Just so I know.
I'll do an advance, a preview.
Okay.
Our next meeting is scheduled for March 5th.
March 5th, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
and thanks, Michaela, for coordinating. Thank you, everyone. Tell our favorite intern hello.
I will, thank you, thank you so much.
So Cynthia, do you have anything you want to ask?
I just want to say thank you for the presentation. Very informative. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome, my pleasure.
Thank you very much. So Santiago, should we see if the public has any questions?
I'll ask that anyone in the attendees room, if you wish to ask a question, please raise your hand using the Zoom feature and I'll unmute your mic. Giving it a moment here to see if folks click on the hand symbol in Zoom. I don't see any hands raised.
Okay, well, Santiago, do we have anything else that we need to do other than to adjourn at this point? I want to thank you also for really excellent. I want to chat with you some more when we're done. here.
Okay, very good. Somebody's
Yeah.
gonna. For me.
Yes.
Always.
Thank you. That next item is to open it for public comment. For that purpose, anyone in the attendee room, please raise your hand if you wish to make public comment at this time. Seeing no hands. Back to you, Board Member Lightstone, to adjourn at this moment if you
Okay,
like, or
well-
to make some closing remarks.
I don't have any further remarks unless other board members do. I'm looking at Cynthia now. So we'll adjourn the next meeting, as the chair said, is March 5th. We don't have a closed session today. So I want to thank you again for coming to share all of your
My pleasure.
work with us. And with that, I guess we're adjourned.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Santiago, thank you, Cynthia.
You're welcome.
Bye.